Now to moderate our next panel discussion, the topic is diversification of revenue streams in Australian clubland. Would you please welcome the Managing Partner at Sports Recruitment International, Jonathan Harris.
Thanks, George. Hang in there, people. 4:15 p.m, undoubtedly the graveyard shift. So we'll run through this over the next sort of 45 minutes or so. Just to briefly set the scene, a few months ago I wrote a thought leadership piece on the diversification of revenue streams at Australian sporting clubs. And it was from this paper that Lou asked I bring together a panel to discuss this trend here at the MIS conference. We're really fortunate that we are joined by the leaders of 4 benchmark clubs and a real cross-section from across our industry with Hawthorn, West Tigers, Sydney FC and Hobart Hurricanes. These represent 4 different major codes, but each from different geographies, different histories, and differing times in the marketplace, ranging from 100 plus years to 15, 12 and 8 years old. They're also probably at different stages of their commercial evolution, so we can investigate that a little bit further. I'm hoping for a wide-ranging discussion as we cover the challenges and pitfalls of modern commercial strategies. This conference is called Money in Sport, so hopefully 45 minutes or so from now, with the help of Tanya, Justin, Danny and Nick, we will have a better understanding of how the modern sporting franchise operates. It's perhaps important that I set the scene, just briefly, about what's gone before. So our focus today is on the major professional sports clubs and teams across AFL, NRL, A-League, Super Rugby, Cricket, and Big Bash, not necessarily Sheffield Shield. And with their rejuvenation of the past 2 or 3 years, we can probably include Super Netball and the EMBL into that category. This means there are 74 clubs and teams in Australia across 7 major sports, and this is set to become 77 in 2019 based upon a couple of announcements that are pending over the next few weeks. This means that Australia has the most highly competitive and some might say cluttered marketplace in the world. 36 of these clubs and teams combined are in Sydney and Melbourne, which for the guys visiting from the US will tell you is just a crazy number. When we refer to traditional revenue streams, which is not the focus of the discussion today, these include ticketing, membership, sponsorship, events, broadcast, match day, and digital. And these have been the focus of club commercial departments for years and years, and will always remain the focus for clubs and teams for years to come. The focus for today isn't about innovation in these traditional revenue streams. The last 10 years have seen amazing innovation and improvement, refining those traditional functions and improving the matchday customer experience. Our focus is more on the diversification and development of new revenue streams. SRI, my organisation, has recruited into these areas for nearly 20 years. And we've witnessed the evolution of a commercial head or CCO role extensively over that period. Perhaps sort of 5 to 10 years ago, these roles became more focused. About 10 years ago, these roles were focused exclusively on those traditional revenue streams. And then 3 or 4 years ago, we noticed a distinct addition of words such as strategy, project, innovation, language, and this became part of the CCO's remit. And then perhaps in the last couple of years, we've clearly witnessed the creation of independent roles, whether they be chief strategy officers or head of strategy or head of new revenue, and these positions are exclusively focused on new revenue streams, as per Tanya's role that we'll hear a little bit more about today. These new functions focus almost exclusively on strategic partnerships, innovation and major projects, with clubs prioritising non-traditional revenue growth as part of their strategic plan. The thought leadership article that I wrote identified 7 really common areas that we were starting to see being added to a club's commercial opportunities. the article's online and easily accessible, but that includes the development of women's competitions, multi-club models where perhaps an AFL team buys a baseball team, or the Melbourne Storm purchasing Sunshine Coast Lightning in netball. And then also, of course, as discussed in the last session, the development of esports teams and franchises joining into the commercial mix of a traditional sport. But they're also, clubs are becoming media and content businesses. They're developing foundations and philanthropic strategies. They're looking into China for expansion opportunities. And then the development and phenomenon of exhibition games that Lou can tell you about this evening over a few beers. Beyond those streams, in the past 24 months, we've witnessed ever more varied in-house investments as profitable clubs become mini venture capital firms. And in preparation for this session, just in 2018, we've seen clubs investing in daycare centres, in coffee shops, in wearable technology, in elite or high-performance partnerships with universities, educational learning, property development, tourism, touring, social media businesses. The list really does go on and on. People might think this is just the exclusive domain of those larger clubs, the Crows, the Broncos, the Bombers, Hawthorn, the Rabbits. But in 2018, we've seen this at clubs such as Melbourne Victory, at the Giants, and even at the Cronulla Sharks, who acquired a coffee importation business. So I'll now join the panel, and you'll be hearing more from these guys who could really make me look more intelligent than I am. But I think it's important as an introductory question, I perhaps ask all four of you, why you think this is, and what this phenomenon and where it may be going. So Nick, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting, I suppose, next horizon for sport. One of the challenges with sport generally is that the inventory that we have, if you will, is perishable. You can only sell a seat at a sporting event once, and once that moment in time is gone, you don't get to sell it again. And so consequently, you have to look at ways to be able to expand your revenue base. And also the nature of most of our sports as well is that they're very lumpy, that you'll have times in the year where you get a lot of your revenue, and that's got to pay for all of your business throughout the entire year, which can create cash flow problems where you have sort of 6 months of plenty and 6 months of famine. So one of the keys, I think, around building financial security and sustainability is not being so reliant on, the lumpy parts of the season, and also not being reliant on revenue streams that are, really strongly tied to performance. Everyone knows that if you're going well, all of your KPIs around, ticket sales, membership, etc., are up, and if you're going poorly, they tend to be down. So it's a way to smooth your revenue streams, but also make them more secure in the future.
Danny?
Yeah, look, I think from an A-League perspective, we are probably different to some other competitions and leagues where our clubs are almost wholly private enterprises owned by individuals. So our jobs as CEOs is to drive enterprise value in the organisation. And I tend to look at our club as a business. And in doing that, you look at what is our business. Our business is all about football. My job is to extract as much money out of the football economy as I can to build that enterprise value and the financial sustainability of the club. And to Nick's point, those things are only coming out of limited pots if you don't look to diversify. And I think equally we own the only assets we really own on our balance sheet are our players. We don't own our stadium, we don't own our training grounds, our offices, and the other key thing we own is our IP. So for us to really look at ways in which we can leverage our IP both domestically in Australia, but equally for us in football internationally, predominantly in Asia, given we play in the Asian Football Confederation, and for us as a club in the Champions League, leveraging that brand of Sydney is something that we really look to extract more value from. So it's definitely important that we look beyond the traditional revenue streams to ensure we deliver the value that's required to keep the owners happy.
I suppose our journey of recent times has been such success, and I suppose hitting our peak in terms of football revenue and the traditional mediums that we've had. And I guess when we reassessed our strategic plan moving forward, and we really noted that we needed to diversify my role was really heavily around consumer and community, and we did focus on philanthropic donors, and our Indigenous programs are completely funded by that. But where was the new revenue going to come from? And our strategic plan is actually called Dare to be Different. So from the board and the exec, it was how do we actually find the time, because we're all so busy doing roles that are consumed in traditional football revenue. And that was to, I suppose, take me out of the traditional portfolios and really spend time assessing where we could find new revenue. Interestingly, my pathway started around our women's team and how we could actually fund that completely. So it was kind of still traditional revenue, but how do you build a team from scratch and then commercialise that? We're also moving to a new, block of land out at Dingley. Our foundation paid for that. That was $7 million, so we'd worked really hard on that space. And then to own a piece of land and own our own facility, we're now looking at how can we diversify the revenue out of that facility as well. So we're more than a footy club, as we like to say now, and we've entered the VNL with Hawks Netball, partnership with NBL team Phoenix. So we continue to think about where's the revenue going to come from, particularly if we're not having a great on-field season.
Yeah, look, we're all different from different codes, and so I think the one fundamental principle though, and certainly from our perspective, if you just bring the question back to the economics of a club, our cost base now sort of sits around the $30 million mark. So if you just apply your normal CPI principle of 2% to that, there's an extra $600,000 net you've got to find every year. That's without investing into the business. And we've been fortunate over the last 3 years where we were losing $5.5 million 3 years ago, and we're going to make profit this year, which is terrific. But we've invested about $700,000-800,000 per year over that 3-year journey as well. So, and I think we talk a lot about what revenue means coming in, but I think it's also about what strategically you invest in to create that revenue becomes really important. And that's sort of where Jonathan mentioned that strategic aspect. Foundation, not dissimilar. Thanks for stealing our foundation guy too, by the way. So foundation becomes a key, and I know in the AFL, I think there's been over $48 million raised through the ASF, and in the NRL 300,000. So we identified that as a real opportunity 12 months ago and set ourselves a task of actually spending a lot of time with Hawthorn and Geelong and Richmond, those that have been successful in the AFL, and were able to generate $1.2 million in a really short period of time. So that's significant. And the next aspect is really trying to, I think, create, and I think Danny mentioned balance sheet, trying to create a healthy balance sheet that enables you to actually leverage funding from elsewhere, so you can actually go and invest in those businesses that Jonathan alluded to before.
Thank you. Tanya, as I said in the introduction, I think your role is the sort of perfect. Your new role is the perfect example of this very trend. Having worked in the more traditional streams of consumer business previously, the CEO sits you down and says, "Okay, Tanya, I want you to go and do this new role," and you roll in on the Monday. And where does it start? I mean, is it entirely a sort of blue sky whiteboard, or can you sort of share with us the sort of makeup of the role and the type of things that you're looking at, or opportunities that are coming across your desk?
Yeah, like I said, I was. It kind of actually happened like that. So it was very much focus on our women's team, get that right in terms of finding that. And we also have what we call our Dare to be Different committee, which is made up of a lot of external entrepreneurs. So sitting in on that, and it's really about leveraging their expertise. I know that's not mine in terms of sourcing, really diverse revenues. So we established this committee, we workshop ideas, and really it was honestly set a project, and then what are the blue sky, and there's a lot of business cases that get written up and then just thrown out, so that can be quite frustrating. But in terms of, I'm actually finding my role is I'm travelling at 110% now, so to look at, I need another resource. So, so it's continually growing. But yeah, it's really setting yourself that project and having a few others on the go with experts around you, really, from different, businesses to support you.
When I started this review, I must admit I probably thought that this was all about just the decline and that cluttered marketplace and how competitive the sponsorship dollar is now and so on and so forth. And the more I sort of looked at things, you start to see that it is organisations such as Hawthorn, the Crows, West Coast, Collingwood, the Broncos, Rabbits, Swans, who are really starting to maximise their membership streams, who are filling the stadium so that they can't do any more in match day. A question really for the chaps, Justin, Danny, Nick. You guys are operating with smaller clubs, and your focus therefore is still trying to maximise the traditional. How do you ensure that this very trend doesn't mean that your clubs get smaller while the bigger clubs get bigger?
It's a good question, and I think when you're looking at new business opportunities, there's a risk of becoming busy fools. So everything looks like it's a great opportunity, and you sort of resource up and you're doing a whole lot of great things, but none of them are making any money. So I think the first thing is you need to look at scale and frequency. I think they're the two filters that you need to put any opportunity through. So is it big enough that it's going to be profitable? And the second one is it occur regularly enough that it's going to be profitable? And it doesn't tick those two boxes. I think that any opportunity that presents itself, and I think Tanya probably touched on it, there's a lot of opportunities that come your way and everyone thinks that everything can make money. And particularly in that sort of startup mode, you're like, oh, we could do this or we could do that. And, scale and frequency are the two things. And then I think, for us, it's about determining what your market differentiation is. So we're the only professional sports team in Tasmania, and I'm sure Sydney FC and West will have their point of difference as well. So we look at, okay, well, we've got a sort of captured market of 500,000 people, which is not an insignificant amount that we actually don't have to compete with anyone against, really, from an Indigenous sports team perspective. And you compare that to Sydney, where you have 24 professional teams. So a 500,000 catchment area is actually quite a large one, and I think traditionally Tasmania and Tasmanians have used as an excuse for financial underperformance, and I don't think that it is. I think that it's just as hard to make money in the Sydney market, and just because Sydney's a bigger city doesn't mean that it's any harder. So I think you've got to look at your points of difference and try and exploit those.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, I think Tanya hit the nail on the head. One of the biggest challenges being in sports is we're in the results business, and those traditional revenue streams are affected by the on-field performance, and if you're only reliant on those revenue streams, then if you do have a dip in performance, then you're going to feel it on the revenue side. So what we tend to do is also look at the strengths of the club outside of their on-field performance of our A-League or W-League team. And in the football economy, one of the unique things that we have going for us is that we are able to sell our players. And therefore focusing on things like youth development, creating academies and pathways that will allow us to give kids the best opportunity to grow as footballers, but the byproduct of that is they become saleable assets for us to monetise down the track. So, I wouldn't just say it's selling players, but that's an example of something that really doesn't have an impact on how we play on a Saturday or a Sunday. But equally looking at things like that are unique to our sport that allow us to drive revenues.
I agree with everything I think that's been said. I'll just add that if you're talking about the one thing on a balance sheet that we do own is the IP, when you're looking at acquiring businesses or going into partnership with businesses, the one thing we do have is a really sticky fan base. And, with all the opportunities that are presented or you go searching for, the one thing we're constantly looking for is can we actually vertically integrate that business into our business and actually take advantage of those sticky fans.
Nick, the Big Bash, I guess at a kind of macro level, is perhaps the greatest example of this diversification of revenue streams. You were on the ground in its very earliest days at Sydney Thunder, and then now in Tassie. If you kind of go back and review what was on that whiteboard, and when they first started to think about it, did anybody anticipate just how big it would become?
Well, Andrew Jones, who was the strategy head of strategy at the time of Cricket Australia, who you may know, would say yes, he did. But I think, look, when Cricket Australia were working on that at the time, they identified that there was a gap in the market, which was really, kids 8 to 16, cricket wasn't really resonating with them at that time, and so really in terms of, and it's business speak, which upsets a lot of people in the media at the moment, but we do run businesses and you do need to use it. But segmenting your fan base and working out where are you undercooked and where are you overcooked. Cricket in the sort of 2000s was hugely successful and hugely popular with males 40 plus, but not so much at that segment of sort of boys and girls, particularly aged between 8 and 16. So I think it was identifying where we were undercooked, and then at the same time, the phenomenon of T20 cricket was just growing in England. They were starting to have some great results there. Really, one of the I think the masterstrokes of the Big Bash was Mike McKenna's idea, which was to have 2 teams in Sydney and 2 teams in Melbourne, which for every other sport is very normal, but for cricket, trying to get traditional cricket people to give it away from state-based thinking. And I talked about this at a Tasmanian sports forum recently. They're talking a lot about a Tasmanian AFL team, but we need to understand that the states of Australia were set up in 1900 or 1901 to govern the country. They weren't set up as the best way to work out where you should place your sports teams, and so consequently, for cricket to have this revolutionary idea of maybe having 2 teams in Victoria or 2 teams in New South Wales actually started to get, for the first time ever, cricket have a club-based sporting league, which footy and rugby league and soccer have had for 100 years, and that diversification has ultimately led to what you see in the Big Bash.
Tanya, you touched upon the EMBL partnership, which is fascinating and plays to one of the sort of core tenets of this diversification. Can you just expand upon that a little bit? Educate us as to the strategic thinking behind this partnership and the opportunities you hope it will create.
So I guess everyone's talked about, what's our strength off field, and we certainly felt that Hawthorn Football Club, we've certainly led in the governance of our club. We've really progressed in terms of the way we use our content and our, what we saw an opportunity to provide a shared service to an NBL club. And I suppose it's common knowledge that we looked at an option of purchasing one. We did a hell of a lot of due diligence around that, which now has been of benefit now that we're supporting one. So really, our conversations with Tommy Greer was around, look, we strongly believe that we can provide a service around finance and IT and all the things that they needed, as well as providing some support around IP. And the synergies were really strong with Southeast Melbourne Phoenix. We have a really strong relationship across the Southeast in terms of we've got our Next Generation Academy out there. It's the highest participation of basketball. So there were so many synergies where we felt like we could provide support, and we struck up an agreement. So we spend a bit of time out there and work with the guys around some strategy, their strategic plan, but in essence, it's around shared services.
And playing devil's advocate a little bit, you're a team that's been at the top of the comp for a fair while, and 2 years' time, you're outside the 8. The keyboard warriors are saying, firing up and saying, why the hell are they spending all this money on this basketball team, and they want the money diverted into football operations. How do you win that PR battle now?
I suppose the beauty of it is that we went the other way and we're not spending any money. And that is something to really assess, and it's been interesting to see, I suppose, a Collingwood who is so, they're really into being quite aggressive around purchasing teams, and I think that could be a challenge for them if, with netball and really, are they focusing on core footy? Whereas for us, this is a management agreement. It's my job to do that. It's actually not affecting really anyone else within the business. So, look, we're financially benefiting out of it. So, although even yesterday people did not understand that, but we'll get there.
To Justin and Danny, you both spent a fair amount of time in the US. In looking at that marketplace and identifying opportunities to bring across that play to the sort of diversification of these revenue opportunities, what are the best examples of products or properties or innovation that you've seen in those marketplaces that are ripe for the Australian marketplace? Maybe Justin first.
I'm not sure we're in the position to do this one, but I just came back from an interesting tour of best practice and learnings through Atlanta, Alabama and Louisiana. And the Atlanta Braves, long story short, basically moved from Turner Field in the city, which they'd been located for 1,000 years, to a site that there was 80 acres and a gas line basically ran underneath, and no one was, the government couldn't sell this parcel of land because of the gas line. So what Atlanta Braves decided to do was actually position to the government that we'll actually move the gas line for you and we'll build on here ourselves. And they went out and again, it's to scale and they've got capital and all the rest of it, but they've basically now changed from Turner Field out to 20 miles away, which is, best part of 30 kilometres. They've not only built a new stadium there, they've built and gone into partnership with Omni, which is a 5-star hotel. They've got a 3-star hotel, they've got cinemas, they've got retail shops, they've got a convention centre. It is literally like build it and they will come. So what they've spent is astronomical. The vision that they had to do this and the execution in 3 years, they didn't do it in stages. They just built everything at once and found partners through the way. And as you walk through now, you've got everything is basically branded Atlanta Braves. I asked the obvious question, traditionally MLB is a very traditional game, and how has your fans found moving 30 kilometres away? People love it. People love the atmosphere, the offering, the game day experience is now second to none in the MLB. So again, unfortunately, we're not in that position from a capital perspective. But if you're looking at, the grand vision, their biggest income stream now is, or that they consider themselves real estate developers. So, interesting.
I think from my perspective, it has to be blockchain. I don't really know what it is actually. I need to spend more time with the Fergusons, but it wasn't blockchain. It was. I think the shared services model you talked to, Tanya, about if you look at the major franchises in the major cities in the States, they typically have one owner. Obviously in New York, where I spend a lot of time, Madison Square Garden owns the Knicks, the Rangers, Radio City Music Hall, a bunch of different entertainment properties. They have one head of commercial, they have one head of ticketing, they have one marketing manager. So I think, we in Sydney particularly, you have, I'd hate to think how many commercial managers there are. You've probably placed most of them over there. It's SRI. But look, the reality of that is that, we're in a competitive environment, so therefore looking at ways in which you can diversify using the one thing that differentiates you is what's important. And one of the things I did learn from, say, the Yankees is a good example, is that they're a trusted brand. So in the baseball and sports community of New York, they are a very trusted brand. So if they attached their IP to something that had a somewhat of a tenuous link to baseball, they always had a leg up on any other private enterprise trying to generate revenue in that space. So, for example, at Sydney FC, we'll look at things, and we're looking at things that if we attached our brand to it, would a parent be more likely to take their kid to that? For example, beach soccer. Should we own beach soccer in Sydney? Because if we put on a Sydney FC beach soccer competition, then is that going to be more likely to be attended than, say, if some private enterprise Brazilian who walks up to Manly and says, I'm going to set up a soccer school down here? We'd like to think that our brand will drive more loyalty out of the community. So therefore that represents an opportunity. So I think in the US they do that very well, and it's sort of an extension on the Braves there in that they use that brand to really drive into other areas of business.
And I guess the advantage of a country the size of the USA is that most of them are sort of one-team towns or two-team towns, which enables that. Chatting to Tanya earlier, you look. I posed the question as to why Southeast Melbourne Phoenix aren't the Southeast Melbourne Hawks. And anecdotally, you sort of gave me some pretty interesting perspective upon Collingwood and the Magpies and their netball team.
That was off the record, by the way. But Oh, look, we had a pretty strong opinion that it can polarise. Geez, who here hates Collingwood? You know, I'm going to go for the Vixens for sure. So there was a really big discussion around, I mean, I'm joking about that, but there was a strong discussion around, even when we were looking at an NBL licence, around what we would be branded as, because you do create that angst, I suppose. You know, it's tribalism, you know, and for anyone that lives in Melbourne, you know, you're going to hate other teams, and do we really want to segment ourselves and create this issue, I suppose? So I think, you know, with the Phoenix, it needed to be genuine, it needed to be about the southeast Melbourne, and smartly they've gone down that path, and we'll support them in a management and shared services manner. And look, you know, Collingwood will continue to do what they're doing, but, you know, it'll be interesting to see how they go from a netball perspective if they're not winning and not getting the crowds.
If I can just add to that, I think if you think of what the true benefit of doing something like that is opening up a broader fan base. If you're continually just throwing more things on the same fan base, you're not going to grow your revenue pie. So by branding it the same thing, you're essentially doing that. So if you look at the models abroad, as you touched on, it's not the New York Knicks basketball and the New York Knicks hockey team. It's that they build value in those other brands, and by doing that, they're opening up broader fan bases.
Okay, that makes sense. I was determined this doesn't become another esports conference. However, given that within these tenants, these clubs are now looking at esports franchises. Obviously, we've had that with the Crows, with the Bombers. Have each of you had esports opportunities come across your desk? Danny, you can maybe share a little bit more about the E-League.
Yeah, I think we're probably unique, probably similar to Darpin on the last panel. We have an endemic game that our team plays in already. So, you know, any kid can buy FIFA and play it and play for Sydney FC today and Perth Glory or whoever other A-League team. So it wasn't a big leap for us to go into esports because you know, there was an obvious game there already for us to tie ourselves to. You know, I'm probably less enthused about branching out into, say, Fortnite, for example, in terms of building a team to participate in that, because I think we've got a long way to go in driving our own E-League and equally driving our own sport or our own club within that sport. So I think at those clubs in the AFL that are potentially a little bit further down that continuum, that for them to start looking at those things makes a little bit more sense than it might do for A-League clubs. But definitely the E-League was a great success in its first year. It was probably far more successful than I thought it would be.
And success is in eyeballs. Have you begun to commercialise that?
Yeah, we have. I wouldn't say we're getting bags of cash, but at the end of the day, what it's doing is it's giving us another channel to talk to different audiences. And you know, we looked at some crossover data around who was watching the E-League on Twitch or on Fox when it was on that platform, and who was watching our games on Fox during the genuine A-League or W League programming, and they're vastly different. There was a crossover, but there was still a much wider audience. So I think for that reason, particularly for a sport where one of our biggest strengths as a code is our younger demographic profile. So we need to look at ways in which we can engage them more effectively, and the E-League definitely is a step in the right direction for that.
Nick?
We haven't been approached. I'm not sure that Korea have their eye on Tasmania at this point. Look, I think that it's another example of diversification. I was a little bit shocked when the panel before were describing them as sports. They're games, and they're great games. But you know, I think the role, particularly with gaming in sport, is around growing interest in the sport and actually getting kids off the couch and thinking, I've played as Sydney FC, I wouldn't mind actually going and playing for a team now. We at Cricket Tasmania have a broader role. We're not just a club, we're also responsible for participation in the state. So we'll always look at things through a participation lens. And I actually think gaming's really good for that. And you know, my kids play games, and it's the way that they learn all of the heroes and villains of any particular sport. So it can have an outcome that has nothing directly to do with generating revenue, but can ultimately drive participation and engagement, which leads to attendance, buying merchandise, you know, playing the sport. And I still think, you know, esports is very, very fragmented, you know, and it's changeable. The games that were popular 3 years ago are not the games that are popular, you know, in 2 years. Battlegrounds was massive last year. Pokemon Go was massive 2 years ago. And so you just got to, there's an element of risk there. And I think if you anchor yourself to something traditional such as sport, then there's probably more longevity. It's sort of like saying I'm going to get into film. There's a whole lot of different sort of films you can produce. It's so fragmented. And I still think that sport remains the anchor in terms of, you know, connection to tradition and tribalism.
Yeah, we went and sought out and did some due diligence on esports. I think our position was that we didn't have the capacity to actually monetize. And the esports play is really about a demographic change in your current demographic, and obviously being able to monetize and mobilise data. And clubs all over the world, still it's the biggest challenge to be able to get that one single voice out to their customer to make sure that we can actually maximise and understand the journey. And also I think to Nick's point that we sort of spent a bit of time researching where we'd like to invest our money, and we've really focused on investing it into our community. We've got quite a large geographical spread through our 2 foundation clubs, from basically inner West Sydney all the way out to the outer west. So yeah, we've invested in that, and that's really about getting that authentic engagement with the community, and we hope that that translates into fans turning up, fans buying merchandise, and sort of going back to that traditional form almost. But yeah, that's why we made that choice. But I think it remains topical, by the way, and we're certainly always monitoring it.
Yes, we've had a lot of offers, and it's sitting at that committee that I talked about earlier. You know, in the AFL world, it's, you know, who's going to do it first and who's going to do it the best, and we really want to, again, do our due diligence around it. We weren't really sure about the brand fit and where it would sit with us, so yeah, we're currently just exploring it.
Okay, 5 minutes. Similar questions been asked at the end of most of the sessions that I've seen today, but just a bit of looking glass, look forward sort of 5-8 years and look at your commercial mix within your club. Just sort of 60 seconds from each of you.
Awesome. In our mix, I would think that the big opportunity lies for, firstly, membership growth. And I know that's seemingly traditional, certainly south of the border into Victoria, but if you're looking at the inequality of nearly 500,000 fans and NRL clubs having sort of 20,000 members, I think there's a big opportunity there. I think sponsorship is going to remain fairly stagnant. We spoke about the inventory and the availability of assets. I don't think the appreciation of assets increases at the same level as your cost base does. So I still see businesses like us looking into diversification around acquisition of businesses or partnering with businesses, not dissimilar to Richmond in regards to the leisure centre and being able to vertically integrate and get value out of the sticky customer.
I think for us, or I suppose the IP part is, and I didn't touch on, is we haven't moved down the path yet of creating content and really becoming like a service provider in our digital and marketing space. We think we can really leverage that. And I think we will, with our new move to Dingley, we'll look at, again, like a bit of a Richmond model, aligning ourselves with different businesses and bringing that to Dingley. So it really will be that asset base plus our IP.
Yeah, I think from a football perspective, we're obviously going through a fair bit of change at a governance level, and the recent changing of the FFA board and what's most likely a move towards an independent A-League will probably change our revenue mix quite substantially over the coming years. That aside, I think for us it's about definitely leveraging our IP in the community. As I said earlier, the football economy is a big economy, it's a growing economy. There's a huge amount of participants registered playing football who want to be better footballers, that we could play a role in that educational process. There's equally a lot of people playing social football who aren't registered at a club, who are playing summer soccer or five-a-side or beach soccer. So looking at ways in which we can lend our expertise and our brand to building businesses either on our own or in partnership with others, I think is going to be a major growth area for us.
I think the opportunity for Big Bash teams is probably diversification of markets rather than necessarily different businesses. So, looking at the globalisation of Big Bash brands, so there's massive cricket passionate markets internationally, and Australia possesses one of the best cricket leagues in the world, which is a huge advantage. So, how do we drive increased revenue out of the interest in cricket overseas, markets that are 10, 20, 100 times the size of the Australian market, and use that to grow our brands? It's probably a challenge for Hobart Hurricanes, but particularly for the Sydney and Melbourne clubs, it's really good opportunities to internationalise the Thunder brand or the Melbourne Stars brand into emerging markets that have got a much bigger market size than Australia does, and much more passionate cricket following than Australia does.
Thanks, guys. So thank you. Just a sort of final concluding point and a sell on SRI. We've been at the forefront of the convergence of sport, content, media and entertainment, and we're kind of real time seeing these industry changes impact recruitment. The prospective candidate pool for these positions is obviously wider and deeper than it has been before. Organisations are seeking candidates with experience from outside of sport who can bring new ideas and skill sets from their differing backgrounds in media, entertainment, technology, management, consulting, strategy, banking, finance or investment firms. The need for increased innovation and entrepreneurial zeal is paramount in all major commercial hires across clubland. Just a couple of statistics that I found quite interesting. I actually, in preparation for this, reviewed our appointments on a global basis for 2017 and 2018 and learnt that 27% of our appointments came from outside the sport industry and 14% from outside the origin of that job, as per my appointments of Danny Townsend to Sydney FC and Justin to the Penrith Panthers from the States. So a good number were returning Aussies as opposed to necessarily importing expatriate talent. But it doesn't always work. I think you really do need to understand that the priority of that organisation is the club itself and the performance of that traditional sporting organisation. And I think it was notable that all of you emphasised that all these revenue streams are about making your clubs better and performing better for the most important, being the members and the fans themselves. So I found that fascinating. I really appreciate you guys coming up. Hopefully that was of value in the graveyard shift and 5 p.m. Perfect. Well done, everybody. Thank you.
Jonathan, there is no such thing as the graveyard shift. This is almost prime time. And once again, very big thank you to both yourself, Jonathan Harris, and Tanya, Gallina, Danny Townsend, Nick Cummins and Justin Pascoe. Terrific effort. Almost as impressed by putting the code wars to one side to discuss business. I loved it.